People are still coming in, and so we'll wait a few minutes and start shortly. So happy to see you all. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm John Travis. I'm the deacon here at St Lad's. On behalf of our pastor, Father Don Snyder, and the entire staff, a very warm welcome. You should have a program like this, and if you don't, please raise your hand and a volunteer will make sure that you get one. It sets forth how we're going to proceed tonight. Inside the program on the right-hand side, you'll see some biographies on our four distinguished panelists, Bob Pavarchi, Candace Clark, Stephanie Stashnik, and Dr. Greg Noveski. The first three, Bob, Candace, and Stephanie, are all employees, healthcare professionals who work at the Far West Center. That's a mental health community, a community health agency, really, at the St. John West Shore Hospital campus. And Dr. Noveski is a psychiatrist and a deacon. And each of the presenters will offer some ideas for us, give us some insight into these various topics, and after which they will answer questions that you'll write down on index cards. Now, the volunteers, right now I'll ask them please, to start passing out to you, should be one on either side of the aisles, index cards with pencils. And as you hear the presentations, you may have a question, so jot it down on the index card, and if you want a particular person to respond, please indicate that. And as the last speaker, that'll be Dr. Noveski, is wrapping up his comments, the volunteers will again go down the aisles and ask you to pass the index cards to them. They'll bring them up to me, and then I'll be able to direct the questions to the appropriate persons. We'll get to as many questions as we can. This presentation is being recorded, and it'll be available on St. Lad's website. Everything, including the PowerPoint slides that we'll be seeing tonight, will be accessible. So by all means, take notes if you like. You'll see that on the back of the program there's a section for notes. So feel free to do that. But keep in mind that all of this will be on the parish website. And that is www.stlads.org. Again, www.stlads.org. If you forget it, you could just type in St. Lad's Parish, Westlake, and you'll find it. Now, after the Q&A session, we're going to ask you to fill out this evaluation form. It should be in your program. And this is very helpful to us in planning future programs. And on the back side, we specifically ask you if you'd like to attend another event on these topics, yes or no. And then how did you find out about this program? And please note as many as apply. We have different ways we've tried to promote this program, from church bulletins to flyers to invites to Constant Contact, which is our email at St. Lad's. It's helpful to us to know what's effective. So that's why we're asking you to fill out this form, and near the end of the presentation by Dr. Noveski, as I say, we'll have the volunteers again come in the aisles and, well, actually, let me correct that. On your way out the door, you can put these in the baskets, and then we'll have a chance to analyze them later on. We're going to have a reception outside those doors. There'll be refreshments, cookies, cake, and the speakers will be there as well if you'd like to chat with them. Please silence your cell phones. And if you'd like to use some restrooms, there are restrooms out that door to the right, and we have restrooms in the cry rooms in the back, women's on this side, men's on this side. So take advantage of that if you wish to use the facilities. So let us please begin with our first presenter, Bob Piavarchi.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for being here, and I'm very impressed. Everybody's in the front rows. Usually when I'm in a sanctuary, you see people in the far back 2 rows are the most populated, so thank you. As I said, I really find this moving that people are coming to learn about mental health, because in the 28 years that I've been doing this, I've attended many a health fair and many things where we fill up information, have things, all kinds of things going, to have people say, and what exactly do you do? I work with mental health. Oh, that must be very rewarding, and they bolt the other way. So, but why is it that mental health is one of those topics that we tend to shy away from? And I think there's a lot of information that we will talk about today, one of which will be addressed later is the myths about mental health that sometimes still are perceptions that are still out there, even with the news media, which is unfortunate. But we as human beings are body, mind, and spirit. Our brain is part of our, both our mental health and our physical health. So we do have to look at, what exactly is mental illness? Mental illnesses are health conditions that involve our emotions, our thoughts, our behaviors, or a combination of some of each of these. They're also associated with distress or problems in functioning. So it's one thing that, when our quality of life is impacted by certain feelings or certain emotions, that's when we have to look at what do we need to do to hopefully prevent, if not work at managing that better. Mental illness is nothing to really be ashamed about. It's a medical condition, just like heart disease or diabetes. If you want to think about it, the brain is about 2.5 pounds of kind of a tofu-like substance, essentially, that feeling. It's not Jell-O like everybody thinks real wobbly. It's about like tofu, but 2.5 pounds. And when you think about all that brain does, it keeps us breathing. It also, our thoughts, our emotions, our memories, our sensations, everything. It's like the motherboard of a computer, and it's the ultimate motherboard. And it's managing everything at one time. So when you think about 2.5 pounds of an organ that's doing that, it's amazing to think that, it's never going to have any problems is probably not likely. So when we look at physical health and mental health, how many of you have ever heard the term, last week, this last week was so hot, I got physically ill. No, we say I got sunstroke, I got heat stroke. So physical illness, we don't go around saying, I'm physically ill, just like I'm mentally ill. Mental illness can be any number of illnesses that we'll talk about, or symptoms that we'll talk about. Just usually we say with the physical health is, I have diabetes, I have heart disease, I have hypertension. It's something that we can attribute an exact, specific illness. And also these illnesses can have a range of severity or acuity. Most individuals will have some form of mental health concern in their lifetime. Just as we experience life, it doesn't mean necessarily it's going to be a full-blown severe mental illness, but think about it. Physical illness. You could have a small cut, which is on one end of the acuity spectrum, just as you could be hemorrhaging internally, which is a very severe thing. The same thing with mental health and mental illness. Serious mental illness can include depression, bipolar, which is also was called manic depression back in the day, anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, or schizophrenia. Those are, again, there's a wide range in regards to the acuities. A depression can be a situational depression, just as it could be a severe depression where you can't move out of your room or out of your home. Their mental illnesses are treatable and manageable, and treatment does work. Usually it's a combination of talk therapy, medication, sometimes group therapies. There's a number of options that can be incorporated into one's life that can help promote mental health and prevent, mental illness or prevent the severity of. Again, mental illness can affect any age, race, religion, income. It doesn't discriminate. Mental illness is also not the result of any kind of personal weakness or flaw or character of upbringing. No one's at fault. When people say, is this nature or nurture? Well, kind of both, depending on the situation. And each person, too, when you look at diagnosis can vary. Even though you have the same diagnosis, you ask two people their experience, and it can be very different. So it's something we need to really look at the whole picture. Let's take a look at some facts. It's actually very common. 1 in 5 individuals, adults, will experience some form of mental illness in a given year. Again, the statistics even show usually 1 in 3 have depression. 1 out of 24 have a serious mental illness. 1 in 12 can have a substance abuse disorder, which can coexist. Usually the vast majority of individuals with mental illness continue and function in their daily lives. You probably either live with, work with, or live next to individuals that are probably having issues with their mental health, but we don't always know because it's not something you can visibly see. And I think that's also sometimes what scares people about mental illness. If I have a specific illness, for example, say I have psoriasis and I have blotches all over me, you can see the illness. If I say I have chronic depression, I look like anybody else, so how does that work, or how does that look? How can you be sick? How could you not work when you look like you or I? But also, when it looks like you or I, that means, hey, if you can look like me, does that mean it could be me? Sure thing. And that's the scary part, and it doesn't need to be scary. Let's take a look at some basics. We have basically 4 emotions: anger, sadness, happiness, and fear. Mad, sad, glad, fear. Unfortunately, there's not a rhyming word. I would love that part of me just wants that last one to rhyme. But ultimately, these are our basic emotions. And when our emotions, get out of hand, that's when illness and or situations can occur. How many of you have never been mad or angry? Remember, you're in church. Or have been sad? I think sometimes, obviously happiness is one of those emotions we all like. And fear, how many have not had some form of fear in their lifetime? These are normative emotions. They're the range of emotions each and every one of us deals with. I liken it sometimes, too, for those individuals that are artists, it's kind of like they're the basic colors, the primary colors, and you kind of can mix them in between. Because, again, you can have a mixture of emotions. Something wonderful could be happening, but just as, hey, I just bought a new house, but it may be, just as I'm buying this new house, also I'm leaving something else behind, my old one. And there's happiness about the new, but there's a little sadness about the old. So these basic emotions are normative. However, when these emotions become problematic or they've become essentially a disorder, where they get in the way, when my depression or my sadness becomes overwhelming to the point where I can't function in my day-to-day life. I'm not going to school, I'm not going to work, I'm calling off, or I can't even move out of bed, or hey, I haven't showered or shaved in days, there's a problem. So that's where, again, mental health concerns or mental illness is where the normative becomes more of a disorder in the fact that the function that we have from a day-to-day standpoint is somehow being impaired. So we want to look at again, it's normal to be afraid, but sometimes when is that fear keeping me from doing the things I need to do? Going to the grocery store, going to the bank. Nowadays, granted, you can do everything online and you really don't have to move out. But the issue is we need to be interactive with one another. And as we'll talk about when we get to touch base about loneliness. But we need one another, and so we need interaction. So these basic emotions can potentially get in the way with our mental health. Let's take a look at those in regards to fear. Our anxiety disorders or fear-related disorders. Panic disorders, when you feel so panicked that you feel you can't breathe, your body is, your heart's beating a mile a minute, you're feeling like you're going to pass out or even die, or you're going to have a heart attack. Panic disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder is an anxiety disorder. I just heard an interesting joke. I said, they said that they want to rename it CDO because it's alphabetized. But anyway, it's actually a very, there's a great book called Brain Lock, which was written by Schwartz about this. Obsessive compulsive disorder is where you have the obsession, the thought, and then the compulsion, the behavior. And what it is you become so anxious that you feel you need to do something in order. So, hey, I just left my house, but I thought I left the toaster plugged in, and I'm afraid that the house is going to catch on fire. I better go back and check it. Okay, I go back, check it, it's out. Get back in my car, but you know what? Did I really check it right, or is it really off? And it sounds kind of silly or strange, but it can become very paralyzing for individuals because they're driven by these thoughts and then the compulsions. I got to do the compulsion or the behavior as a result. Social anxiety disorder, being around people. Some people are very afraid to be around people. Some people are, and actually, one of the most common things that an example of social anxiety disorder is public speaking. To speak in public is one of the person's most feared things. That's why in school they have speech class, both in high school and later on in college, to get you used to talking to other people or talking to groups of people. So social anxiety can stem from being very afraid to be around groups of people because what am I going to say? How am I going to be perceived? What's that going to look like? That can go to the point where you have agoraphobia. Actually translates in the Greek, fear of the marketplace, but fear of going out and being around people. So instead of, I had a lady that, she lived in a high-rise, senior high-rise. Had agoraphobia. She would go and get her mail at 2 or 3 in the morning so she didn't have to run into any of the other ladies in the building. She would set her alarm clock because she didn't have to do that. And it's like, you really want to do that? That's, you know. But she had her own fears of fitting in and her own social anxiety as well that kind of led to the agoraphobia. Specific phobias are those phobias that actually have a name. Agoraphobia is like one of them, but also arachnophobia, fear of spiders, hydrophobia, the fear of water, claustrophobia, confined spaces. Most anxiety disorders, or anxiety in general, is a generalized fear that I know I'm afraid, but I'm not really quite sure why I'm so afraid in this circumstance. And the fear sometimes can be paralyzing. That's where, again, we get into generalized anxiety disorder. You have this generalized fear of living, in the world, and how do I manage? And take a look at the next one, mood disorders, our mood. Depression, sadness. It affects how a person feels, acts, and thinks, and it's intense and longer lasting than just general sadness. This is what I'm saying earlier. It's one thing, we all get sad, but if we're so depressed that we're not functioning, we're not getting out of bed, we're not showering, shaving, doing the normal everyday tasks of life, that can be problematic. Depression is one of those illnesses that is very insidious. It starts very mild and it can be paralyzing, it can be deadly. When we talk a little bit later about suicide, this is why depression needs to be caught very early, because there can be a very deadly result if we don't manage it. It can develop slowly, again, draining energy, pleasure, meaning from a person's life, when typically the things you used to do that you don't really feel like doing. Hey, where's Mary? She always would come to to our group. Oh, she's not here today. What's going on? Oftentimes most people see on the outside the other individual, and that's where I think too, as an audience, we need to be able to ask questions. Hey, I haven't seen you at, group last week. Are you doing okay? Well, not really. I've been depressed, can't get out of bed. Let me come over and let's have a talk. It's important that we ask those questions because a lot of times with depression, we don't see it where others do. Trust me, it's like, hey, you need to shave, or oh, you're really smelling. You need to go to the shower. What's going on here? That's not your usual self. When we see those changes, that's when we have to say, I think we need to have a little talk here and we need to see what's going on. Again, people can experience depression differently. Also, usually a lot of times it comes in physical symptoms. I have all these aches and pains, and where most depression is usually diagnosed? Your general practitioner, your primary care physician. You go, I'm not feeling great. I feel like I had the flu. I'm just not feeling well. Tests are run, nothing's found. It's depression. If you always rule out the physical first. Let's rule out there's a physical cause, and if there's no physical cause, then we look to the mental health cause. Is there something that's triggering this physically, or is this something that we're seeing is caused by, by emotions? But oftentimes that's where it's first picked up. Again, very treatable. Depression is sometimes called the common cold of mental illness. And most people have some form of depression probably in their lives. We have a major depressive disorder, which again is recurrent. There's also a persistent depressive disorder, what they used to call dysthymia. For those of you who remember what a real pilot light was before the electronics, a pilot light would stay burning all the time in the stove. And that was kind of dysthymia was kind of a low-grade depression that just kind of never went away, but people tended to function with it. You can function to some degree. We have postpartum depression, which is experienced by women that have had children. It's due to, again, hormones, chemicals, but also, as a friend of mine said, you get this young baby now at home, this alien creature. No way of really communicating other than through cries. Now, is this their messy cry? Is this their hungry cry? It's also it's part of an adjustment disorder too. So it's no wonder parents don't, especially women have it, but because they're primary caregivers, but also the hormonal piece. But it's also, this postpartum is very difficult for the fact that it's a major change in your life. And your whole life gets kind of turned upside down, even though you may have had 9 months to prepare for such. The reality kicks in and it's like, oh my goodness, why am I not caring for this situation as much as I would like? Bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is what they used to call manic depression, where you had mood swings, highs and lows in mood. Usually the mania would trigger behaviors that, some people did excessive spending, traveling, all kinds of impulse issues. And it's, again, as it's individualized. I remember having a group of individuals that all had bipolar disorder, and when they started comparing notes, we looked at the diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, and said, okay, this is what they say are the criteria. And they said, well, I do that, but I don't do that. Granted, you have to have several of the criteria to have the diagnosis, but it was interesting just to see the variations on those individuals that had that particular illness. So, mood disorders, problems in our mood, trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. We've noticed oftentimes post-traumatic stress disorder, we hear it we had heard it coined during the Vietnam era, when vets were coming back and had experienced horrendous things in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, the guerrilla warfare. It was not the same old, but actually what they found with warfare too, trauma was there well before. World War I veterans, they didn't call it PTSD, they call it shell shock. In the World War II era and into the Korean conflict, we were calling it combat fatigue. People would come back from and have issues that were based on trauma. Nightmares, flashbacks, watching out, being hypervigilant or very overwatching, especially at night. Also, traumas can be from any number of things, from childhood trauma, sexual abuse, physical abuse, experiencing a fire, being in an accident. We find more and more trauma is underlining a lot of our clients and our patients, that there's a lot of times there's an underlying trauma disorder as well that's also triggering sometimes their anxiety and or their depression. One of the first waves we've seen in this actually was with we have a program called Help for Mom, which is our moms that have postpartum depression. But we were finding the birth of the child was an initial onset of remembering traumas from before. And it was enough of an event to trigger the past to come forward. Again, I had a client that he experienced nightmares and flashbacks, was living in an area which was kind of its own combat zone, was not able to sleep. They placed him on medication for sleep, and his body overrode it because he was so fearful at night that something was going to happen. So he slept during the day, so we had a change of night and day in your habits. Most of the world, though, works 9 to 5 and works business-wise. So as protected as he felt in the evenings, the problem was, it was a matter of functioning. Our world functions during the day. The next kind of illnesses that we're going to look at are thought disorders or psychotic disorders. One of the most primary ones that we heard of is schizophrenia. Chronic serious mental illness that usually takes place anywhere from 18 to early 20s. Usually it takes place, the trigger is usually the first experiences away from home, going away to college, or first major job, or entering into the real world. And it causes people to have psychotic thinking or delusions, sometimes hallucinations. But for those individuals, their experience is real. When they're saying they're hearing a voice, they truly are hearing the voice. We may not hear it, but their brain is encoding things that they're sensory, or they're either feeling, thinking, hearing, but that sensory is actually happening for them. And oftentimes, individuals with schizophrenia don't recognize that they have a mental illness because it's something they they experience that they think is normative until somebody says, no, I don't hear that either, or no, that's not what's really happening, but you're obviously experiencing that. But also what we've seen with schizophrenia is now that they can live very successfully in the community. As I pointed out, that gelatinous mass or that tofu mass of 2.5 pounds, our brains really have been studied at most probably the last 100 years. When you think about anatomy and physiology, you can go back to the 16th century. Leonardo da Vinci has folios of anatomical drawings that looked, you could see what the heart, the intestines, all these things looked like. But then, you know, you have the brain, which literally in the last, period of probably the last 30 years, really we're learning more and more about it through science that we have available, to be able to see the brain in action through testing like MRIs. We can actually see brain activity as it's working, where before we couldn't. So that's another proponent. We're seeing a lot of times individuals with mental illness, the prognosis is very good. We just need to get help in a timely manner. The last I'm going to address is substance abuse or addictions. Addiction is also a part of the brain process. Years back, again, sometimes it goes the chicken and egg. What came first, the addiction or the mental illness? We often see in history individuals, writers, and people that were artistically, bent, that you have, like, for example, an Ernest Hemingway. He had bipolar, and how did he medicate? He medicated with alcohol, unfortunately. So a lot of times people self-medicated, which then became a very slippery slope into addiction. So sometimes what comes first, the addiction or the actual mental illness, is sometimes questionable, but oftentimes when they're there, they're together. Now I'm going to pass the mic to Candace, and she's going to talk about the myths that I had mentioned earlier, the myths about mental illness.
Okay, we're going to talk about myths and the common myths that we might hear in our day-to-day lives. The first one, it's a parent's fault if a person suffers from mental health problems. Not at all. As Bob mentioned earlier, mental health disorders are caused by biology, environment, or a combination of both, nature versus nurture, right? Number two, people with a mental illness are violent or dangerous and should be locked away. We probably hear that quite a bit, at least 20, 30 years ago maybe. Hopefully that's changing, ending stigmas. Most people who have a mental illness struggle with depression and anxiety. As we talked about, depression and anxiety we see a lot of that in our society. They have normal lives, but their feelings and behaviors negatively affect their day-to-day activities. Okay. Myth number 3, all people with schizophrenia are violent. Very little violence in society is caused by people who are mentally ill. The media likes to portray mentally ill people as dangerous, which is not true. And people with a major mental illness are more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. Number 4, depression is a character flaw, and people should just snap out of it. If it was only that easy, right? I wouldn't have a job. Right. We would have nothing to do because we treat a lot of depression. So research shows that depression has nothing to do with being lazy or weak. You know how many times we heard, oh, they won't get out of bed. They're just lazy. Not true. They literally cannot get out of bed. It results from changes in brain chemistry or brain function. Number 5, addiction is a lifestyle choice and shows lack of willpower. We hear that quite a bit, right? The reality is addiction involves complex factors, genetics, the environment, and sometimes underlying psychiatric conditions such as depression. When people who become addicted have their underlying vulnerabilities, it's harder for them. It's just harder for them in life. Number 6, people with a mental illness lack intelligence. As Bob mentioned earlier, mental illness can affect anyone. Mental illness is a single rare disorder. No, not true. Each mental illness is different. It's treated differently. We see it every day, like Bob talked about. Bipolar is different. One person's bipolar is different from another. One person's depression is different from another. And people with the mental illness never get better. Not at all, right? Treatment works. We have group therapy. We have individual therapy. We have medication. We have support groups, as Stephanie will be talking about later, in different recovery that we can do. So I'm going to move on to the influence of loneliness on mental health. The statistics that I'm going to talk about are from a study that was done in 2018 by Cigna. It was their loneliness study. In loneliness, if it's untreated or unaddressed, it can be lethal, like any other mental health. Like we got to catch it in the early stages. So Americans who live with others are less likely to be lonely than those that live alone. This does not apply, however, to single parents or guardians who have children. They are more likely to be lonely. So just because you have children in the home does not mean that you'll be less lonely. Generation Z is the loneliest generation and claims to be in worse health than the older generations, which is interesting, right? Generation Z, which is adults ages 18 to 22, have the highest loneliness, and the greatest generation, adults 72 plus, have the are the least lonely. Which if you think about social media, which I'll address in a second, you think, okay, who's looking at their phones more, right? Right, exactly. So Generation Zers tend to have more cyber relationships, and the older generations tend to have more face-to-face. Like, we like to talk to people. We don't like to talk on our phones. We might actually have real conversations with others. Social media use and loneliness. The study states that social media use has nothing to do with whether or not you're lonely. The younger generations report the same loneliness whether they use more or less social media. And the greatest generations have more interactions and face-to-face, so they say they're less lonely. People who report being less lonely are more likely to have regular, meaningful in-person interactions. They're usually in good overall physical and mental health. They have good relationships with their coworkers and they're employed. It doesn't mean if you're not employed, you can still do volunteer work, you're getting out, you're doing something, you feel like you have a purpose. They have found a balance in their daily lives, so getting the right amount of sleep, socializing, and that lovely work-life balance that we all want to achieve. Those with a sense of belonging are less likely to commit suicide. A feeling of belonging really acts as a safety feature. We all want to belong somewhere with people, doing something, having a purpose. So to help combat loneliness, they recommend that you get enough sleep, that you spend time with family and friends and people that you care about, that you increase your physical activity, and you have a good work-life balance. Suicide awareness, not one of our favorite topics, but it's a very important topic. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. It's the 3rd leading cause of death for youth ages 10 to 14, and the 2nd leading cause of death for people ages 15 to 34. We see it all the time on the news, right? Each year in the United States, an estimated 37,000 people die by suicide, and 1 million people attempt suicide. Men are 4 times more likely than women to take their own lives. Men use more lethal means than women do. So they're using the guns, they're using the suffocation. Women are more likely to overdose. So they're more likely to use pills. So what are some warning signs? How can you tell when someone might be thinking about suicide? You might notice a change in behavior. You might notice that they're talking or writing about death, dying, or suicide when these actions are out of the ordinary for them. They might start making comments of being hopeless, helpless, worthless, expressions for having no reason for living, and they might increase their alcohol and/or drug use. They might start to withdraw from their friends, family, and the community, as Bob mentioned earlier. They might not be seen in group or at church or at local trivia nights. They might start participating in reckless behavior and other riskier activities, driving fast, drinking, gambling, just things that they just don't care. You might see dramatic mood swings, mood changes, and they start giving away prized possessions, putting their affairs in order, trying to tie up loose ends, changing a will. These are all things that you will start noticing. So what are some risk factors? What makes a person more likely? So losses and other events. A person's more likely to suicide when they have other losses in their life. If they've had previous suicide attempts. I know one of the things we ask about in our assessments is, have you had any past suicide attempts? It's important to know that. If they keep firearms in their home, are they locked up? Are the bullets put away? Do they have other weapons? Chronic physical illness, including chronic pain. How many times do we hear someone say, I don't want to deal with this pain anymore, I'd just rather die? It's a risk factor. Exposure to suicidal behaviors of others. We hear a lot in the news that someone commits suicide, and then we hear other people commit suicide. When we had Anthony Bourdain commit suicide, or Kate Spade, my clients started talking about that a little bit more. If they can do it, why not me? Or a history of suicide in the family. So how can you help? We all want to know how to help, right? We want to remember the 5-step action plan known as ALGAE to help a person in crisis. So you want to assess for risk of suicide or harm. Ask, are you thinking of killing yourself? It's okay to ask if you want to do you want to kill yourself? It's not going to plant a seed. It's important. They need to be heard. Keep them safe and reduce the access to lethal means. They say if you can, 7 seconds is all it takes. If you can distract a person for 7 seconds, they're least likely to go after that gun. It gives them time to think. You want to listen openly. Carefully listen and hear what they're saying. What is truly going on? Give reassurance. Make sure they know that they matter. This crisis is temporary. Death is permanent and final. Encourage professional help. Help them seek out a counselor. Help them go to the nearest emergency room. Put the National Suicide Prevention number in your phone. You'll have a resource list that you'll get soon that states we have a crisis line in Cuyahoga County. We have crisis lines in Lorraine County that clients can call, and they want to help you. They are there. So often we hear, well, they won't help. That's something that they just can't help me with. Yes, they can. And the people on the suicide hotlines, some of them have been there, and they know how to help. And lastly, encourage self-help and other supports. So stay connected to them during the crisis, after the crisis. Say, how are things going? I'm checking in on you, making sure you're doing okay. Support makes a huge difference. And there, I put up the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, which is in your packet and also be in our resource guide. And I'm going to pass on to Stephanie, who's going to talk about what is mental health and wellness.
So now that we covered mental illness and kind of what it is, we're going to talk about the other side of things, which is what we're working towards, so wellness. So when we have somebody who comes in with mental illness, these are things that we're trying to improve on. So first, those day-to-day activities, like Bob was talking about, that suffer when someone is struggling with mental illness. Are they able to get out of bed? Are they able to leave the house, take care of their personal hygiene? Also, are they engaging in productive activities? So are they able to go to work or school or wherever it is that those structured activities they engage in? Are they going on time? Are they missing a bunch of days? And when they're there, are they able to focus and function effectively? Relationships, are they able to maintain those relationships? How's their communication going with those important people in their lives? And then lastly, how are they coping with like stressors and changes, different unexpected events that we all have in our day-to-day lives? How do they adapt? How do they cope with those? So when we're trying to build up wellness in someone, it can come in a lot of different forms of treatment. So Bob had mentioned talk therapy, that one-on-one, sitting down with a counselor, processing emotions, just talking about different things going on in their lives, learning coping skills. In addition, there's medications, so meeting with a psychiatrist to get medication that will hopefully help reduce symptoms overall. There's also peer support services, so meeting with someone who's gone through something similar. So if I'm struggling with severe depression, meeting with somebody else who's also had depression but has learned coping skills, learned how to manage. And then there's some alternative therapies. There's a lot that are less common. One that's used for very severe mental illness is electroconvulsive therapy. So someone is put under anesthesia and an electrical current is actually sent through their brain, and that can help reduce really severe symptoms. And then there's support and self-help. So going to family members, friends, just to lean on, vent, and then self-help books, learning about the diagnosis that I have, learning about the triggers for that, and different coping skills. So wellness we can break down into 8 different dimensions, and we'll just kind of go through each of these quickly. The emotional dimension of wellness is just, again, that can I cope with life? Can I deal with my emotions okay? Do they feel like they're out of control, or do I feel like I can manage them overall? Then there's the spiritual side of wellness, which is, do I feel like I have a sense of purpose? Do I have an understanding of the meaning of life for me? Do I have questions about that? Am I exploring, or do I have a solid grasp on that? The intellectual side, so am I exercising my brain regularly? Am I using my creative talents? Am I learning new things? Am I learning new skills? Putting my brain to use. And then the physical side, so am I getting enough sleep every night, and is it healthy sleep? Am I having a healthy diet, good nutrition, and am I taking care of myself as far as physical activity, exercise, kind of getting my body moving? Next is social, so looking at my relationships. Am I able to form healthy relationships, have kind of a sense of belonging with other people? Do I have those supportive people to lean on? Occupational, so with my work, am I satisfied there? Do I feel like it's adding to my sense of purpose? Is it bringing meaning to my life or enriching me? Am I happy with it? Financial, so not just how much money I have, but am I satisfied with that? Do I feel like I'm struggling constantly, or do I feel like I can make ends meet overall? And then last one is environmental. So do I have places that I can go that bring me some sense of joy or comfort, just places that kind of make me happy overall. So one important thing to note is that mental health and physical health are very closely connected. So if I'm having mental health concerns, it's going to negatively affect my physical health, but it goes the other way around as well. So people who have mental health illnesses tend to be at higher risk for physical health problems like diabetes, high blood pressure, malnutrition. And if I already have those things, but I also have a mental illness, it can actually make them worse. But then same thing the other way around. So if I have physical health problems like a chronic illness or an injury, an accident happens, something like that, it can negatively affect my mood, my thoughts, my emotions, and can cause symptoms of depression, anxiety, those sorts of things. And then we just have some statistics on here that 68% of adults with mental health conditions also have medical conditions, and then 29% of adults with medical conditions also have mental disorders. So when we're trying to improve wellness in someone and help them learn how to maintain that wellness when they're recovering from a mental illness, we want to talk about resilience. So what resilience is it's just the ability to cope with stressors and changes in life, traumatic events. We all go through them at some point in our lives. Something happens that we don't see coming, and we don't really know what to do with it. And so what we want to do is build resilience. So make it easier to cope with those things, adapt, work through it. So we just have some tips on how to strengthen resiliency. The first has to do with connections, so just making sure that I have connections with important people in my life, that I feel like I have people I can rely on for support, that I can go to when I need to talk about something, just so I feel less alone overall. The next has to do with acceptance, so being able to say that, like, yes, this thing is happening, some change has occurred that I'm not happy with, but I'm going to learn how to accept it and then move forward. Reaching out to help others helps build resilience, because if I'm able to help somebody else with something, it tends to make me feel more capable and more confident that I can handle different problems that I'm going through. Setting realistic goals, because when we set unrealistic goals for ourselves, it tends to make us feel very disappointed and discouraged when we can't reach them, which interferes with our sense of resilience. So making sure that they're realistic, but also kind of figuring out those small steps we can take to reach those goals. The small steps that we have as we reach them, we kind of build up that confidence, like I check things off my list, okay, I can do this, and it tends to make us feel more motivated as well. Next is just having a positive self-image or self-esteem. So improving that confidence, feeling like I'm happy with myself, I like things about myself, I know my strengths, and that makes me more capable of handling different problems in life. And tying into that is just trusting our instincts. So again, if I feel capable, I'm probably going to trust my gut that I know what to do when I'm encountering this unexpected problem. Taking care of yourself. So self-care is something I know I talk to all of my clients about, because as our stress level and our emotions, those negative ones, tend to build, eventually they reach a point where they just feel like they're not manageable. I don't know what to do with them, I don't know how to handle this, and that's where we really have breakdowns. But if we engage in regular self-care on a daily or a weekly basis, it helps keep those emotions at bay. So they're more manageable when I deal with them every day and I relax and take care of myself versus letting them build and just get completely out of control. And then lastly, that physical mental health connection again. So making sure I'm taking care of myself physically, I'm eating right, getting a proper diet, getting enough sleep at night, going to the doctor regularly, getting that exercise, and then also avoiding drugs and alcohol, because we know that they have a very negative effect on our mental health and our physical health overall. So then, just to wrap up this section, we just have this quote, never give up on someone with a mental illness. When I is replaced by we, illness becomes wellness.
Okay, before Dr. Nowitzki begins his presentation, I just want to remind you, if you have some questions, jot them down. You may have some in mind right now, and we'll have the volunteers near the end of Greg's presentation gather those cards, bring them up to me, and that'll be our chance to pose questions to the panel members. Greg?
Well, thank you all for coming this evening. It's a real privilege to be here to talk about this issue. I'm going to start a little bit by talking about psychiatry, and then I'm going to get into some of the spiritual issues, as I'm both a psychiatrist and a deacon. When John initially approached me, I thought it was because I was a psychiatrist and a deacon that he would ask me to be on a panel like this. But after I met the panelists, I realized that he needed a senior citizen to balance it off. So that's me. That's me. So a lot of what the other people have said was going to be the preface to my talk. So I'm just going to kind of go over this real quickly. There are many myths that we live by. So a typical myth is, if I'm nice to others, they will be nice to me. Have you heard that one? Well, how has that worked out for you? Okay? That's not exactly the way life works, right? And so all of us that are alive experience darkness in one way or another, okay? You can't avoid it. So everyone here that is here this evening has suffered in one way or another. Now, some people suffer in little ways. All of us have had little crosses that we bear. You know, the times that you've been rejected for something you wanted to belong to, but then people have bigger crosses. All of us have been to funerals of people that we love, right? And we suffer because of that. And some people have indeed profound crosses. And so there's varying degrees of darkness. Our title this evening is Pathways Out of Darkness, and darkness varies. So among the worst forms of darkness, not all of the darkness is in mental illness, but many people with mental illness issues are indeed in a dark place. And we know that psychotherapy can help and medications can help. All the things that we've heard about this evening, social supports and so on can help. And the research is still going on. But we have a problem, and the problem is the brain itself. So I want to talk just a little bit about the human brain. So the human brain, most estimates are that it has about 1 trillion cells. And they're not all the same kinds of cells. There are different kinds of cells within the brain. And there are billions of synapses that exist between these cells. So they communicate to each other by what we call neurotransmitters, chemical messengers. Maybe you've heard about that. Most people have heard about serotonin. Okay, well, there's a lot more than serotonin in the brain. There are multiple different kinds of neurotransmitters in the brain that interact with other cells at different receptor sites. And then something happens within the cell once they do attach, and that's poorly understood. So every cell is unique in the way it responds once it's attached to serotonin or dopamine or whatever neurotransmitter we're talking about. So the brain is generally not very well understood. I mean, in the popular literature, you would like to think we know a lot. We don't. We don't know a lot. All right. In medicine, generally, there's a real good myth, and that is we know a lot. So think of something like hypertension. Okay, they ever hear of essential hypertension? Yeah, that's a term. It's called essential hypertension. The word essential in medicine means we don't know what causes it. It's essential hypertension, all right? So it's like most forms of hypertension are, guess what? They're essential hypertension. Now, the most common myth that you'll read about is that the brain is like a computer. Don't believe it. The brain is not like a computer. A simple example of that is that our brains change minute to minute because we're interacting with the world around us. You might be alarmed to know that by just listening to me for the last couple of minutes, your brain has changed a little bit. But our brain changes minute to minute for all kinds of reasons. We're interacting with our environment, with other people, and it changes because of our free will. We make choices. Do I pray this evening, or do I watch pornography? That'll change your brain. Do I eat this or do I eat that? It'll change your brain. Our free will changes our brain. And free will has eluded research. A lot of neuroscientists say that there is no such thing as free will. Don't believe that either. The reason they say that is because they haven't found it. Because they haven't found it, they figure that it must not be there. But every 7-year-old knows that she has free will, right? A child knows that she can choose to eat that cookie or not. All right, so, the child has to calculate, makes a little free will calculation on whether to do that or not. And the list goes on and on about the brain. So, for example, we are self-aware. We know, and we know that we know. We know that we exist. Philosophers have been talking about this for centuries. Computers are not self-aware, obviously. Now, some computer experts think that that should be one of the, that they can eventually get to that level. Computers can be self-aware. And the test for that would be to put a computer in a dark room, unplug it, and see what it comes up with. My guess is it's not going to come up with very much, all right? So people can sin, and we can lose our souls. Computers never sin. They just lose your data. Computers are made by people, whereas people are made by God. Psalm 139 tells us, God tells us, you formed my inmost being, you knit me in my mother's womb. I praise you, so wonderfully you made me. We are what we call imago Dei. I'm sure you've heard that expression. We're made in the image of God, in the likeness of God. God made us, but we're still in need of redemption. And this gets into a little bit more of a complicated area that I'd like to touch on this evening. All of you know the Adam and Eve story, right? Original sin. So the Adam and Eve story tells us that they misused their God-given freedom. They didn't eat the forbidden cookie, they ate the forbidden fruit. And so we began this dance with darkness because we're a bit broken, and so is the world in which we live. What helps sustain us through the suffering, the darkness that we encounter in life? Initially, religious thinkers thought that we could avoid suffering if we kept the rules. The early Jewish nation said that if you made all the sacrifices just right, choosing the very best animals or the best grain, and you made the sacrifice at the right time in the right place, everything would be fine. There would be no problems. That didn't work out very well for those people because things still happen to them. But people still believe it. Indeed, Christians believe it. If I become ill or I financially struggle or suffer some other sort of assault or calamity, I must have done something to deserve it. Have you ever heard that line? I've heard it from many patients over the decades. And it's a fairly common myth. Of course, in our better moments, we know that that's not true. Good people suffer. Indeed, innocent people suffer. Babies suffer. So, began thinking about why is that true? The book of Job was an early attempt to try to come to terms with this. Why is there darkness in the world and a problem with innocent suffering? Job was a righteous man. He's portrayed as always doing the right thing. And so he was very rich, which goes along with the old Jewish thinking. He had all these animals and a wonderful family and perfect health. And then what happened was he began losing those things. His animals began to die, the crops didn't grow, kids were leaving him, dying, his wife died. He became sick, and he ends up on the proverbial dung heap, is the way the story goes. So Job is saying to himself, why is this happening to me? And what does he do? He begins talking to God about it. And as a matter of fact, he begins complaining to God about it. The interesting fact about the story is Job stays in relationship with God. He talks to God, he complains, and eventually God gives him an answer. But it's not the answer that he necessarily wanted. Because what God tells him is, where were you when I made the earth, when I made the heavens, when I made you? And then he said, trust me. That's the answer to Job. Job has talked himself out, and he basically becomes silent because Job has met up with God's providence. Providence is a word that we don't use very much. You probably won't hear it as in a homily anytime soon. John might give you, might come, might give you one.
Especially now that I've heard it.
But it's a Catholic word. I'm going to give you a definition of God's providence. This is from the Catechism. God's providence, the disposition by which God guides his creation toward its perfection, yet to be attained, the protection and governance of God over all creation. In other words, God is in charge and we're not. God's decision to trust, Job's decision to trust, doesn't end his problem, but it does shed some light on his darkness. Some light on his darkness. There's a mystery to innocent suffering, and it's shrouded with this God's providence. And it's a difficult area to talk about because people are hurting. And we all know there are people that are hurting, and sometimes there are no answers, and we wonder, why are people hurting? And we don't happen to have the answers to those problems. To understand the answers to those problems, somehow we'd have to know the mind of God. St. Paul tells us in the first letter to the Corinthians, at present we see indistinctly, as in a mirror. Jesus never promised us that we would bear no crosses. In fact, Jesus told us, take up your cross and follow me. Those were his words. Jesus told us that he himself would suffer, and he did. The cross itself is a mystery. Christians believe that our crosses as members of our Lord's mystical body can be united to Christ. It's called redemptive suffering. My mother taught me a few things when I was young. She taught me how to count. Greg, do what you're supposed to do, or there's going to be problems. 1, 2, 3. She taught me how to count. The other thing she taught me when I didn't want to do something, clean out the garage, clean out the basement, mow the lawn, get the cobwebs from under the bed, whatever it was, she would say, offer it up for the poor souls in purgatory. Have you ever heard that one? That's redemptive suffering. Okay, and I imagine myself as a boy with all those poor souls literally leaping out of purgatory. And they would fly up to heaven because I was doing what my mother told me to do. But that's trivial compared to what a lot of people go through, obviously. The suffering of Jesus itself was redemptive. So our relationship, our connection with Christ, helps bring some understanding to our darkness. Consider for a moment Jesus on the cross. The suffering Lord says, he basically prays the 22nd Psalm. You ought to take a look at it. All of you, I'm sure, remember the words. My God, why have you forsaken me? Remember those words? He's on the cross. The psalm goes on. Why so far from my call for help, from my cries of anguish? My God, I call by day, but you do not answer. But by night, I find no relief. Innocent suffering. Those are the words of a person in anguish, are they not? Those are the kinds of words that anyone who is innocently suffering might say. What we don't do, though, is we don't read the rest of the psalm. And it's important to read the psalm and pray the psalm to the end. Our Lord knew the psalms very well. He would have prayed them every day of his life. And he certainly knew the 22nd psalm. He knew all 150 of them, I'm sure. So it's important to read and reflect on the ending of the psalm. Because the final line is, the generation to come will be told of the Lord, that they may proclaim to a people yet unborn the deliverance you have brought. Those are words of hope. Our Lord's trust in his Father never fails. Trust is the Lord's way out of darkness. And trust is our pathway out of darkness too, if we can find it. And sometimes it's not so easy to find. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I brought some holy cards, and there are 2 holy cards that I brought. Please feel free to take one if you wish. One of them is a prayer by St. Augustine, which is on a commentary for the 138th Psalm, which he talks about faith in God and the ups and downs of life. Many of you may know that St. Augustine was a doctor of the church. The second holy card is from another doctor of the church, St. Teresa of Avila. St. Teresa of Avila was a mystic, and she wrote a very beautiful prayer that was found in her breviary at the time of her death. And the Trust in God prayer is available to you if you'd like a copy of it. Put it in your prayer book. It's a good one to pray once in a while. Thank you very much.
Okay, our volunteers are collecting these index cards now, so we're going to turn to the Q&A session. Here's a question for Dr. Noveski, psychiatric question. Can you have a combination of various diagnoses like depression, agoraphobia, etc.?
Yes, you can, and it's common. Common. You know, a lot of illnesses tend to overlap. They call that comorbidity. So comorbidity has to do when illnesses tend to occur together. Sometimes it's cause and effect. So for example, if we have untreated hypertension, you're more likely to have a stroke, right? So they're comorbid. But a lot of psychiatric disorders are comorbid for reasons that we do not understand. And so if you have, for example, OCD, you're more likely to have a major depressive disorder. So yes, it's very common.
A question for Candace. Candace, if I think someone is suicidal, is it okay to ask the person, are you thinking of doing something drastic, or are you going to hurt yourself, as opposed to what you said, are you thinking of suicide?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the important thing is to have that conversation. Say, are you going to kill yourself? Is this something that you're planning? What is your plan? What are you thinking about doing? Do you have the means? Do you have a firearm in your home? Do you have that? Like, that's what we look at, and we especially will assess when we're talking about suicide with our clients. What are your means? Are you able to do it? And are you thinking of killing yourself? Yes.
So is it important to use that word kill or suicide, do you think?
Absolutely.
You're not going to put the idea in someone's
No,
head.
the idea is in their head already. I think, oftentimes you'll see these ads on television about, medications, or these may cause thoughts of suicide, especially a lot of times with antidepressants, of thinking, if you're depressed, you already are more than likely having had a thought or two that I'd really not rather be here. They're having suicide thoughts already. We want to know, are you really thinking, and seriously, are you thinking of killing yourself? Because if so, do you have a plan? How severe? Because then that amps up what do we do in that, and how soon do we need to get, what kind of intervention do we need to do?
Okay, Bob, here's a question for you. Treatment helps, but is there a cure for personality disorders?
Cure, we all like cures for everything, but no, there's no cure. Part of it's about management, whether it's a personality disorder, whether it's or a medical disorder, or a mental illness, a mental disorder, any of the above. It's about management. How can we manage those symptoms so they're less intrusive in our lives and don't create problems or havoc in our lives?
Thank you. Stephanie, if someone's experiencing a depressive episode and they have no one to talk to or call, what do you suggest that person should do to seek out some help or get some assistance?
We would definitely encourage like mental health treatment, so trying to find a counselor or someone to talk to. But then in addition, there's other things as well. There's like group therapies they can do, there's support groups people can go to, but the biggest thing is that they're talking to someone. So obviously, like I said, mental health treatment is important, but if they can find other kinds of support as well, even if they don't feel like they have family or friends to talk to, any kind of support can be helpful overall.
And to what extent is social interaction, follow-up question for Stephanie, important in helping people with mental issues?
I would say it's pretty important. That's something that we talk to our clients like right off the bat. We ask them the first time we meet them is who's kind of in your circle. You know, who do you go to? Who do you call when you need something? Who do you talk to? And again, it goes back to just that avoiding that loneliness, because when we struggle with loneliness and feel like we don't have anybody to talk to, it tends to make symptoms of pretty much every mental health disorder worse overall.
Mental illness can be very isolating, and one of the key things that we have found, there's a evidence-based practice. It's a group called Compere International. In fact, we have that program at our center. But it helps individuals. Oftentimes, mental illness is very isolating. So this type of program helps to match individuals with community volunteers to basically be friends. Compere means equal. It's like, I'm not better than you, you're not better than me, we're equals. But also they provide a calendar of activities so people can learn to get out and do things. And essentially, sometimes it's helpful in a group. They have a variety of things that they kind of, you know, they do some coffee nights, or they do things that people know, I can go there and I know some people that are going to be there and it's safe. Or sometimes they've done some group volunteering. So instead of, I'd like to volunteer somewhere, but I'm terrified to go, hey, we're going as a group to do this, it's a little easier. So that socialization is very important. It can provide meaning in their life. For example, their program, there's 2 local nursing homes that we volunteer at to do games with the residents. And it kind of started out with, we had a group of residents that were they're in assisted living, very high functioning, had careers. And they were like, these would be ideal candidates to be volunteers for Compere, but they were in assisted living, they were kind of immobile or less mobile. So why not bring individuals to them that they can interact? So we brought individuals to them and for game nights. And what happened was, both parties forgot about, I'm in here for this and you happen to have this. Hey, we're here to play Scrabble. Hey, we're here to play Uno. They had a fun evening and it was positive, and they got to know each other on first name basis. They were friends, and that meant the world to both parties. It was a win-win. And actually, any community organization, including a congregation or community, you have so much potential to reach out to people and to reach out to one another and to help. Sometimes the simplest things of showing kindness and connection can make a difference. Inviting somebody to sit next to you at church or at a dinner. Hey, come on, you're alone. Come and sit with me. Making a telephone call. I have an example. One of our little ladies at church, sweet lady, was housebound. What she would do is, if somebody would always bring her, before those days before the internet, one of the bulletins. Oh, so-and-so had an anniversary. She would send an anniversary card. So-and-so's in the hospital. She would send get well cards. It meant the world to her, so she felt good. And also, people would say, oh yeah, Dorothy sent me a card. Wasn't that wonderful? You know, it was a win-win on both sides. So sometimes the simplest of things can make such an impact. So I challenge each and every one of us to try and make that impact.
Candace, some of us are caregivers for others with illness. What tips or resources do you have for us?
Can you repeat that question one more time, please?
Sure. Some of us are caregivers for others with illness. What tips or resources do you have for us?
That's a great question. We have NAMI, which is the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. They have groups, support groups for families. We also have other support groups in the community. Even I have clients that come to me just for that fact. They're dealing with the mental health issues of other people, so you can seek out support in a variety of ways. And we at Far West Center, we also have a group that Bob runs, which is called our family group, which is really great. And we have clients that come in with their families to learn, one, we're not alone, and two, what are some tips and techniques that will help?
Does everybody live under the same roof together as adults with, with special needs?
Absolutely.
Stephanie, how do we assist the elderly who are living alone in their home, are lonely, but do not wish to join a church group or attend senior activities at the local senior center, for example?
I guess if you have contact with that person, it would be trying to bring some socialization to them. Like Bob was talking about, being able to reach out in different ways to those people if you have those people in your life, assuming they're willing to have you over their house. But even just making contact by phone and things like that can make a huge difference to people. Even like with our clients, like if we don't see them for a while, we try to touch base by phone, and it means so much to them that somebody calls out and just asks to see if they're okay. So I think that can be a big part of it too. If they're not willing to leave their home, then trying to bring that support to them in some way. Like I said, even if it's through a phone call or something like that.
Greg, how does habitual sin affect mental health?
It's not good for mental health. It's not good for mental health. Okay. So we have like pathways of behavior, and if we reinforce those pathways, they become a problem. So Thomas Aquinas used to talk about if you want to be a good person, you have to do good deeds, obviously, right? If you want to be a saint, you have to do those good deeds so long that they become natural to you, that they become part of your being. If, on the other hand, you make bad choices and sinful choices, then that's what you become. Okay, to some extent, we become what we do. And so our choices, our free will is huge when it comes to, our spiritual lives.
Here's another spiritual question. What do you do if you feel spiritual loneliness?
I'm not sure exactly what is meant by spiritual loneliness. If one means by spiritual loneliness that you feel that there is an absence of God in your life, one of the things about prayer is, usually when we think about prayer, we think about, like, people will say a rosary, which is a wonderful devotion, or they'll go to Mass and they feel that they're doing okay as far as their prayer life is concerned. But prayers, we need to talk with God. And talking with God means, like Job did, sometimes you have to complain. God, I'm not feeling you closely enough. Where are you? Why are you so distant? Why are you ignoring me? Whatever you need, whatever words you would feel are important to you, you have to have a conversation with God. The pastor at St. Richard Church, Father Stolenwork, once said that he made a sidebar comment to me that he went for a walk because he had to have a talk with God. Something was going on that he needed to have a talk with God about, right? And so spiritual loneliness needs to be addressed within one's prayer life.
Stephanie? I'm middle-aged and happy to care for elderly parents and grandchildren who live nearby. However, I feel guilty that I sometimes feel resentful and impatient with the time I spend with them, but feel guilty when I don't spend time with them. What advice do you have?
I think that's where that self-care piece comes in that I was talking about, we were talking about wellness, same thing with kind of like the work-life balance. It ties into that. Caregiving is work. Might not be being paid for it, but it's definitely work. So finding that balance, making sure that as much as you're giving time to other people, you're also taking that time for yourself, for your own self-care. And struggling with the guilt, I think, is common. It's definitely something I talk to clients about if they are more of a caregiving person and they tend to help others, they do feel guilty when they spend time with themselves. And so we talk about, like, working on changing our thoughts about that and understanding that in order for me to better help other people and those people that I'm caring for, I have to be taking care of myself. Otherwise, I'm not going to do a very good job taking care of them either. So that, like I said, that ongoing self-care of finding things I can do on a daily, weekly basis for myself that just make me feel good, make me feel relaxed, relieve stress, I think is a really huge part of that.
I'd just like to make a comment about guilt. Have you ever seen Pinocchio? Pinocchio, remember Jiminy Cricket in Pinocchio? Okay, Jiminy Cricket was Pinocchio's conscience, right? Because he was not a real boy, he was a wooden boy. And if you saw the movie, you saw that he was pretty little, right? He was a little guy. But he was walking along and he would go with Pinocchio. So that's about the size of our conscience. We want a conscience which is the right size. Now, there are people around us that have Jiminy Crickets that are tiny. We want to avoid those people. They do not have well-formed consciences, okay, and they don't have any sense of rightful guilt. But most of the time when we talk about mental illness, we're talking about people that have gigantic consciences. They're like middle linebacker big. They're ugly, they're strong, and they tend to point their finger at you, at the person. And you want to cut that, we want to cut that Jiminy Cricket down to the right size.
Candace, I know my life is good, the usual ups and downs, twists and turns, but I often feel sad. It is an overwhelming feeling that comes over me quickly and unexpectedly. I feel it emotionally and physically. Is this normal?
Absolutely normal. I think we all get to a place or a time that we feel sad. And if we go back to the conversations that we keep having about self-care, is recognizing that sadness, being able to sit with it a while, and then moving past it. It's something that it's going to happen. It's one of those things where you kind of take in and really examine, why am I feeling this way? And it will pass. The one thing about emotions is they do change.
Bob, we have a couple questions here with common themes about getting treatment if you can't find insurance, and in particular the Far West Center. Do you need a referral by a primary care physician, and do you accept Buckeye Health Plan patients? So talk about insurance, no insurance, and what Far West can offer.
Far West Center, we do have, we do assist individuals that are indigent or no insurance. We try to get people to get insurance. We help them to get them, but basically we take a variety of insurance plans, private insurance, but also with no insurance, Medicaid, and various Medicaid formulas, Buckeye, CareSource, we do. But also there are ways that we can look to find insurance, or if something happens, we can also refer accordingly, if need be. But yeah, there are services out there. There are services out there for any person. We just have to know the right referral. But we do have actually a referral person, our intake coordinator, that does see the best fit or the best source that would best suit that person.
Thank you. Candace, how can an adult family member support a juvenile who's threatened suicide?
Adolescents or juveniles. I used to work with juveniles for about 15 years, so this question is interesting. An adult, when you have a juvenile that's threatening suicide, I think the first thing you should do is take them seriously. Even if they threaten suicide every other day, the very first thing you should do is take that threat seriously, get them help, get them to a counselor as soon as you can, and if it's serious and they say, I'm going to kill myself right now, get them to the local emergency room. Because we do have help in the community. We have inpatients for adolescents, and we have wonderful therapists that can work with them.
Stephanie, suppose someone is unemployed. How can they fulfill the occupational dimension of your wellness wheel?
Yes. So mainly what we're looking at is just kind of productive, structured activities. So if someone's not working or they're not able to work, looking at like volunteering could be good, or just any kind of adding structure to their lives is just really important. So finding things that they like to do that, kind of like we were talking about, add meaning to their lives or some kind of enrichment. So I've multiple clients that are struggling with unemployment right now and aren't quite ready to get a job. And so what I talk about with them is building structure, finding things to do on a daily basis that it's like I have somewhere to go, I have something to do, it's something that I enjoy doing. And again, it's like bringing that sense of meaning and building into their sense of purpose is important.
Greg, how can I prepare myself for the periods of darkness that may await me?
Be a well-grounded, holy person
Yeah.
as best you can. It's all of us, one of the things, we need to predict problems. If you were to, it's like Cleveland weather. Okay, it's like Cleveland weather. You know that a storm's going to come eventually. We might have several days good. So in everyone's life, there are going to be periods of darkness. We hope that they're not huge. We hope and pray that they're not huge. But from a spiritual vantage point, the best we're able to do is to stay close to God and to trust Him in issues as we walk through life. That's a lot. That's a difficult thing to do. That's a hard question.
All right, we've gotten through most of the questions. Now I'm going to ask you, please, to open up your programs, and you'll see that half sheet there. So I'm hoping you still have some pencils. If you need some, ask one of our volunteers, and we just want your quick reactions, because this is extremely valuable for us. What you found worthwhile in this event, I found valuable, wish more time had been spent on, would have been better if, and if you want someone to reach out to you in particular, on the bottom of this first side of the page, put down your name, email, phone number, and then we will follow up. And then on the back side, that's very important too. Would you like to attend another event on these topics? We can have particular presentations here on different topics. I myself went to Far West and attended a 2-day, 8-hour session about mental health first aid, it's called. It was great. I learned a lot. One of the points we just discussed, it's not good enough to ask someone, are you thinking of hurting yourself, or are you thinking of doing something drastic? You need to ask the question, are you going to kill yourself? Are you thinking of suicide? And then you assess, do they have the means of doing it? Are there guns in the house? Do they have ideation? Do they have a plan? You learn these things at a more in-depth session, so if you would like to go to another event, you should check yes. And then we want to know how you found out about this. I've got a sign in my front yard on Lake Road. I don't know if anybody saw it. If you saw it, and that's one reason you're here, please check that box. Ooh, here it is. Yes, yard sign on Lake Road. That's my house. So please fill this out, and then and very shortly we're going to ask you to give them to the volunteers. We'll collect them in a basket or whatever way on your way out. We are going to have a reception in there, and I'm wondering how many people came because of the panel and how many people came because of the Costco cakes. We don't have a specific question on that, though. And all of our panel members will be here to answer your questions, so just take a moment, if you would, and complete that, and we will wrap things up very shortly. Again, I want to thank our panel members. In terms of resources, Bob mentioned that there are different things that Far West makes available. There were several questions about where do I go for help. We have a little table in the atrium, and it's got a sheet of resources, and it lists different places you can go. On the program, we just have 2 numbers, really. The 211 number, which is like a first stop for any number of needs. I was not aware of it myself. It's not 911, it's 211, and it's actually manned by United Way, and I called myself to see how it worked, and you have to go to number 4 I think the first one is for landlord tenant, and then there's another one. Number 4 is like the catch-all, and it could be for mental health, it could be for shelter, it could be for abusive situations, and they will direct you to the right person. So those are 2 resources on that sheet in the atrium, and there are a lot more, including Far West, and depending upon what your need is, we invite you to take one of those sheets. So again, I'd like to thank all of the panel members. Let's give them a big round of applause. And thank you for coming, and if you'd like to join us in the atrium, we would love to see you there. Thank you.